Our guest today for the Horn Notes video podcast is Dr. Alex Manners. Welcome.
Thanks for having me.
Great. It's great to have you here. So this is John Erickson, and I teach at Arizona State University, and Alex just finished his doctorate here. And his project, I think, is a really interesting project that will be interesting to a lot of people out there. The title is An Annotated Guide to Published Horn Warmup Routines, 1940 to 2015. Now, in this, I know you cover 38 books. I'm not going to talk about all 38 today, but let's first just ask, what's the first horn warm-up routine, and how did you come about, getting interested in this topic?
The first one that's included in the study is actually one by Max Podig. Max Podig's book came out in 1941. This is kind of an interesting topic for me, though. I was looking for something that was kind of pedagogical in nature and warm-ups. It seems like I was actually surprised that no one had done a project like this before. So I actually found the project really, really interesting going through and writing it.
Yeah, because there's a lot of stuff here, and I remember when we were talking about topics, I'd been struck over the years looking at it that there's hardly, you assume people did warm-ups before 1940, but there actually aren't any published horn warm-up materials from before that date. We have some clues in Schuller and others that, how people, at least some people, warmed up in that older time frame. But let's start talking about, what we've done is we've got 8 books kind of pegged as ones we want to highlight today in this, and we're going to do 4 in the first episode and 4 in the second. So the first 4 books we're going to mention are published, they're older books. So what's the first one you'd like to highlight?
Well, I feel like you're doing a disservice if you don't talk about Philip Farkas's book, The Art of French Horn Playing. I think kind of a landmark publication. I know a lot of people out there still use that as their primary warm-up materials. So it's always worth talking about. And if you're a serious horn player and you don't own this book, you really should. It's still pretty widely available and it's cheap. But the book itself, Farkas includes warm-up in kind of the middle section of it. And it's basically 4 components. So he starts with what he calls a pre-warm-up, which basically is centered on attacks. So he just basically has arpeggios throughout the page, and you just work on playing initial note attacks, and then there's a rest in between each note. And he actually advises you, once you finish an arpeggio to take the mouthpiece completely off the lips. So he's really focusing on just initial attacks. And then the actual 3 parts of his warm-up, he has what he calls a legato warm-up, which is more just kind of lip slurs over the harmonic series, basically arpeggios. But he actually specifies valve combinations for these, so they're definitely intended to be lip slurs. And then he has a set of 6 staccato warm-ups, which basically are kind of scale-type stuff and arpeggio-type stuff without being super explicit about the use of scales. But it's all tongue, so you're working the tongue. And then his final warm-up is long tones, which I kind of found interesting because it seems like most horn players, and not all, obviously.
Yeah, most people would kind of go the opposite direction. They'd start with long tones. Yeah, so this publication, this is like a classic publication. Everybody's seen it, and I've heard there's horn teachers I know that basically this is the only part of the publication they recommend to their students. Is the only reason to buy the book is to get the warm-up materials. And they're pretty iconic. They cover most everything. There's a few things they don't cover, which we'll kind of get to as we talk about others. But this is like a big comprehensive routine. So the next one on your list, though, is the Gunther Schuller. So let's talk about that a bit. Now, what's up with Gunther's warm-up?
Okay, so it's important to remember that Gunther Schuller played in the Met at the time that he wrote this book. So he was really focused on attacks and entrances. And so it's actually kind of a minimalist warm-up. Basically, it's one exercise. The exercise actually was originally published as part of Embouchure Building for French Horn by Joseph Singer.
Yeah, so that's another book we wanted to focus in on here today, which is another classic publication from the 50s. And so he's got a section in there where he's got a lot of different things in it, including the heavy routine way at the back and some other classic stuff. But the very first section is this tone, and he calls it tone and control studies. And it's very, very much like the Schuller, except Schuller kind of defines how to do it a little more precisely.
Yeah. And basically, the way Singer defines it, it's a shorter note followed by a rest, a shorter note followed by a rest, and a held note. The three notes are the same note, same pitch, and then you change pitch levels. Whereas Gunther, when he actually defines it out, he very clearly talks about breathing.
Yeah, I think the breathing part's very important in relation to his first note attacks and everything.
So basically, he has the player play the first note, and then there's an exhale and an inhale very clearly marked. So it's slightly different, and then he gives kind of a pattern that he wants you to follow the pitches on throughout the warm up, and that's basically the entire warm up. He actually, I believe, on the next page says that you should play some scales, but he doesn't actually give you scales to play. It's just kind of play some scales.
Yeah, and I saw this book years ago, and I was kind of puzzled about it. And Gunther came to the campus here at ASU several times and did a couple of master classes early on in my tenure here. And I asked him at one of those times, like, was this really what your warm-up was? And it's like, yes. I mean, this was, like, really it. It was very much, it's just like a half hour of, like, that one exercise. But it makes total sense if that's what you can warm up a lot of ways. And he references, too, in there that this is like who's this from? He says who it's from, I think, in the book.
He credits Richard Moore, who is one of his colleagues at the Met, and you may know that name if you're familiar with Mel Bay's Horn excerpt book, because he's one of the editors of that too.
Yeah, so, and he's actually even got a warm-up book as well, but it didn't make our top 8 list here anyway for this little survey. The last one of the early ones we were wanting...
I don't actually ever think I gave the title of the book, and I should do that, and with all due respect. So to Gunther, it's Gunther Schuller's Horn Technique. It's actually out of print, but it was published by Oxford University Press, and I'm sure you can find it from used booksellers and libraries.
Yeah, it's a classic book. Definitely worth checking out, because often I think about, that book, I've said this before, I'll say it kind of on the record. It's kind of like you read the book and you think he got a hold of a copy of the Farkas book, and it was like, he just was like, everything in this book is, anyway, he says everything so differently than Farkas, but he's so, in a way, he doesn't, point out that he's different than Farkas. He just says a lot of really different stuff, and I think it's very interesting to read and kind of, contrast to Farkas, if you're familiar with Farkas. The last book I got as the early publication is the Forrest Stanley routine.
Yeah, Forrest Stanley, of course, was the former principal horn of the Pittsburgh Symphony, and maybe even better known for teaching at what is now Carnegie Mellon University. Was the former teacher of famous horn players like Dale Clevenger and a whole slew of other players. Really well-known teacher. He had what he called the Stanley routine, which for a lot of years was just kind of a manuscript thing.
Yeah, copies of it got passed around as Xeroxes and stuff, and I have a version of that, and it was sort of iconic in its way. Back in that day too, there's not so much publishing, right? So something like this, Xerox is kind of like self-publishing in a way back then, But anyway, keep going.
Yeah, so his son and another former student actually published the Stanley routine, and it's actually available from Southern Music still today. So it was actually published in 2002, but he pretty clearly dates this in 1967, which is why we're including this in the early portion of the podcast. So within the routine itself, he talks about how basically the whole point of it is to develop endurance. So if you have a student who really needs to work on endurance, it's actually worth taking a look at. And he suggests that the entire routine takes about 100 minutes to play, which seems kind of intimidating to start. But he also says that you can start with just 30 minutes and then you gradually add on more and more time as you go. But the idea is that you'll play the entire book as a routine. So he actually starts with the same Joseph Singer accuracy exercise that the last couple books used. So that's the first thing he uses. And then he groups these into what he calls sets. But there's four major and minor scales, 4 sets of arpeggios, and then endurance exercises, which are basically kind of lip slur flexibility type things. And then there's overtone exercises, which he specifies valve combinations. And then basically they repeat through the book. So you're actually, it's pretty easy, I would think, to kind of terminate just by using 1 set or 2 sets or something and just adding on a set. But the way it's laid out is really kind of cool. And then at the end, you basically have played through 6 sets. So it's worth owning, and especially with the modern edition, it's pretty easy to follow, and it's worth owning. So it's still available from Southern Music Company.
Yeah, great. Okay, so we'll just take a little break here. We're going to have a part 2 where we look at 4 more recent publications. So for now, though, this is John Erickson for the Horn Notes video podcast. So he's a recent graduate from Arizona State University, but I think his topic, so he was my student here. This is John Erickson again, and I started badly, as usual.